In this video, we will start covering Chapter 7 of the book Spring Boot Quick Start. Chapter 7 shows how to use object mapping to map between DTO and entities. We have already covered that in this chapter previously, where we have said that DTO are used to transfer data between controller and service, but service then uses entity to transfer data between service and repository. So when service receives DTO from the controller, it has to map this DTO into one or more entities because a service layer works with entities. And when service layer is done calculating business logic, then it needs to use one or more entities to create response DTO, which is then returned to the controller. This means that inside the service layer, we are using this object mapping in order to map request DTO into one or more entities, or to map one or more entities into response DTO. There are different libraries that are used for object mapping, and we will be discussing these three libraries: JMapper, MapStruts, and Model Mapper. Each of them have a different approach to mapping and are used in different ways. That way you can decide which of those approaches most suits your needs. But we will start with a chapter that shows how to do this mapping manually in order to get a better understanding what mapping is and what these libraries actually do in the background. So this is a schema which shows some basic mapping between request DTO that enters service layer and the entities which are being created from this request DTO. So our request DTO might look like this. It is a Java class that contains data for the author and then data from the book. And inside the service layer, we are using this data to create author entity with name and age, and then to create a book entity with book title. Once the service layer has these two entities, it can use them to calculate business logic. So this schema shows how to map the request DTO into entities, but the mapping can also be used in the opposite direction when multiple entities then need to be used in order to create a single response DTO, which service layer will then return back to the controller. So we will now start with this tutorial that shows how to do this mapping manually, how to manually take data from request DTO and use that data to create different entities. This is a schema that shows what we are building in this Spring Boot application. So our application will receive a JSON string, and inside the controller this JSON string will be automatically mapped into this DTO, author book DTO, that contains data for both author entity and for the book entity. And then we will use mapper then we will manually map data from the author book entity, use the data to manually create author entity and book entity, author entity from these properties and book entity from this property. So this is our author entity that has ID, name and age of the author. This is our book entity that contains book ID and book title. And this is our author book DTO that contains some data from the author entity and some data from the book entity. And this is our controller that has a endpoint, and input parameter in this endpoint will be our DTO, which will be automatically generated from a received JSON string. So this is the JSON string, which will be part of the HTTP post request body. And when this post request reaches our controller, this JSON string will be automatically loaded into our author book DTO shown here. So now inside the entity, we will use different properties from the author book DTO to create our entities, author and book entity. So in order to create author entity, we will use name and age properties of our DTO, and to create a book entity, we will use title property from the DTO. And then we will simply, in this case, return this string, but the point is to show how to manually map DTO into entities. Here we are doing that inside the controller for the simplicity, but in general application, this code will be part of a service layer. We can test this application by using Postman and creating post request and calling endpoint URL, and then inside the body of that request to send this JSON string, and then our endpoint will create this response. This response will be created by using entities, author and book entity, which were created and loaded with the data from author book DTO.